If you want to support the channel, then please check out my Patreon page to gain access to exclusive videos, take part in Q&As, and watch my retrospectives before they go live on YouTube.
Sugai-san, I am the solution to your problems. I can take him out. I'm nothing but a worthless gaijin.
I don't like heroes, Compton. They think the rules don't apply.
Hey, look, I try to do my job, okay? It ain't easy out there. And I'm clean.
You'll walk, Nick. If you tell the truth and you keep your wits. Run your mouth and they'll screw you, man.
I got nothing to hide.
I hope not, for my sake.
We did the math, hero. You're at least $1,000 a month in the hole. You're into the Shylocks you're taking.
Hey, you want to charge me, okay? You charge me.
We'll charge you. Someone will help us out.
Just my luck. I'm under investigation. I'm having lunch with the mob.
Look out!
911, baby. 911.
Please, take her down!
Japanese mob.
Well, our victims are certainly Yakuza. Who's this guy?
It's a Japanese embassy. They want him first. They want somebody to take him back. That's you and Vincent.
What are you?
Detective Sergeant Conklin, Homicide, New York.
The girls want to know if you're the guy that lost Sato at the airport.
Because of your negligence, the man we wanted for a long time has been lost.
Did we let the people carrying your documents, wearing your uniforms, waltz into a secure area? Now, come on, we'll take some of the heat for this, but we're not taking the rap.
Rap?
You see, there's a war going on here, and they don't take prisoners.
What are you talking about?
Between Sato and an old-time boss, a guy named Sugai.
Hey, where's our cop?
It is my honor.
Let the police handle it. No one's gonna help a gaijin.
Gaijin.
Yeah, a stranger, a barbarian, a foreigner, me and you.
Fix it, Nas.
You cannot fix everything. I am not like you. For a moment, I thought I could be.
We kicked ass.
Black Rain hit cinemas in the USA the 22nd of September 1989, and the film arrived in the UK in late January of 1990. Directed by Ridley Scott and produced for a large budget of $34 million, it was financially very successful, bringing in $134 million worldwide, and became a big hit on home video and Laserdisc. It was also nominated for 2 Academy Awards for Best Sound and Best Sound Editing, and in Japan it was nominated for Best Foreign Film. Black Rain was considered a return to form for Ridley Scott, who had a number of box office flops and critical failures throughout the 80s with Blade Runner and Legend. Black Rain put Ridley back on top, and he would follow this movie's success with Thelma and Louise in 1991. Despite Black Rain's success at the box office, critics were mixed on the movie. They loved the visual style which you come to expect from Ridley's feature films, the performances, action sequences and the musical score by Hans Zimmer. What was most criticised was its screenplay, which many felt at the time was cliched, and it lacked any real character development. Roger Ebert felt the visuals overwhelmed the apparent very thin script. The filmmakers were accused of being racist in how they portrayed the Japanese, which displeased Michael Douglas, but the US critics failed to realise that the film was warmly received in Japan, and there were no questions raised about their portrayal in Black Rain. Over the years, the film has maintained a strong cult following, and you could regard it as a hidden gem in Ridley Scott's catalogue of work. The story for Black Rain was envisioned by writer and director Craig Bollantin in late 1987 when he was in Japan visiting a friend. He was standing on a street corner and saw these large American cars go past, and he questioned his friend about the vehicles. He was told these were driven by the Yakuza. Craig didn't know about the Japanese mafia. An idea popped into his head about a simple story of a US cop escorting a criminal back to Japan, and he has to work with the local police force. The US cop has to work with a Japanese detective, and they don't get along. Craig was working on another project at the time and couldn't dedicate all his time to delivering a complete script, so he got the assistance of writer Warren Lewis to help flesh out the story and characters. The script came together very quickly, and Craig met with Michael Douglas's agent, and Michael read the script and loved it, as he was fascinated by the large difference between US and Japanese culture. Michael was a superstar at this point, with the success of Romancing the Stone, Wall Street and Fatal Attraction. He wanted to stretch his wings and try something different. He could comfortably take risks and wasn't concerned about his image. He approached the producers of Fatal Attraction, Stanley Jaffe and Sherry Lansing, wanting to work with them again. They were excited by the story and needed to find a director, and Ridley Scott was suggested as they wanted someone with a strong visual style. Ridley was impressed by the film's premise and liked the idea of a detective story set in Japan. He wanted to capture the energy and feel of New York as depicted in The French Connection. It wasn't a clean and modern city, it looked dirty and grubby, and when you make the leap to Japan, it felt futuristic but also slightly on the edge of falling into chaos. For the cast of characters, we of course have Michael Douglas playing as Nick, a detective who is facing financial difficulties. He is divorced from his wife, who now has custody of their children. This was the first time Michael Douglas played a cop on the big screen. He dabbled with a similar role in the 70s TV show The Streets of San Francisco. Michael would get advice from actual police officers to help give him a better understanding of how to play the part. The costume designer wanted to do something different with Michael's hair by curling it and making it longer, so he appears cool and hip, but also you get a sense that he is not totally honest. Andy Garcia plays as Charlie. The producers were impressed by his performance in The Untouchables, and Andy had a great skill of giving very natural performances, making his character in the film very popular with audiences. Andy said his character was underdeveloped in the screenplay, so Andy did a lot of work to flesh out the role and worked with Ridley Scott to help implement his ideas. The following year, Andy found great success as an actor by being cast in Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather Part 3. Garcia earned an Academy Award nomination as Best Supporting Actor for his performance. Kate Capshaw plays as Joyce, an American working in Japan in a nightclub in Osaka. She played a somewhat similar role in The Temple of Doom. Kate married Steven Spielberg in 1991. She continued working throughout the 90s but would retire from acting in 2001 to focus on her family. The late Ken Takakura stars as Detective Masahiro. Ken was a very popular actor at the time of filming, having appeared in over 200 films. The sets would be mobbed by fans trying to get his autograph. In Japanese cinema, Ken was well known for regularly playing Yakuza gangsters. Ken could not speak a word of English, so an acting coach would help him with the correct emotions and actions to display in the scene. Usaku Matsuda plays as the film's main villain, Sato. This would be his last film role as he was suffering from bladder cancer. Many of the crew didn't know, and he maintained high spirits on set. He would pass away shortly after the film's American premiere at the age of 40. Usaku was a star of film and TV in Japan. During the 80s, he also appeared in many commercials in addition to acting. From the late 70s to the 80s, he toured as a singer, releasing several albums. Like Ken, he didn't know any English and learnt his lines phonetically. And last but not least, we have the late Tomoshiburu Wakayama as Sugai, the head of the Yakuza. The movie was one of his final films, as he passed away of heart failure at the age of 62 in 1992. He was best known for playing the 19th century Ronin warrior in the Lone Wolf and Cub Samurai movies during the 70s. Filming began in October of 1988 and they wrapped in March of 1989. Ridley Scott very early on had scouted for locations in Tokyo, wanting to match the gritty and grubby style he wanted to show visually in New York. But Tokyo had way too many buildings that lacked the architecture he wanted to take advantage of, and shooting in Tokyo would be very difficult with gaining permissions, so they opted for Osaka, which had everything he needed. At first, the government was quite cooperative with the US film crew, but the local press had complained about the government allowing a US production to gain access to specific buildings. Then suddenly the rules changed and Ridley Scott and the producers were given less time to use certain locations. The original director of photography was Howard Atherton, who had shot Fatal Attraction for the producers, but early on he got frustrated with how the shoot was going in Japan, as the Japanese crew didn't gel well with how the US team operated, so he quit and was replaced by Jan de Bont, who had made a name for himself photographing Die Hard. Jan was unsure what aspect ratio the film would be in, so he decided to shoot in Super 35, which made it easier for Ridley Scott to decide to crop the image for 185:1 or 235:1 for CinemaScope. Jan de Bont would also vent his frustration with the rules in Japan. A permit was needed for everything, and they had to be so detailed in their permissions. For example, where the camera would be, if they moved the camera you would have to get another permission, making it difficult for the crew to be flexible with the shots. With costs escalating and the red tape involved in filming in Japan, Ridley Scott decided to shift filming to the USA, with a third of the movie being shot in LA and San Francisco. For example, the sequences featuring Charlie's death, the club interior, and the end battle at the winery were all shot in the USA. The interior of Sugai's home was the Ennis Brown house, which had previously been used for Deckard's apartment complex in Blade Runner. Ridley's first cut of the movie came in at 2 hours and 40 minutes. The producers were thoroughly impressed with how the film looked and how it played out, but they knew it needed further cuts to keep it down to 2 hours. Ridley's next cut it down to 1 hour and 50 minutes. The producers felt it was way too short, expressing disappointment that he cut out a lot of the best material, so he extended the film by roughly 15 minutes to flesh out the scenes that needed further attention. The film opens in New York with Detective Nick Conklin facing possible criminal charges for stealing money, as his old partner was recently caught, and Internal Affairs suspect Nick is also involved. Nick denies the charges, but the investigation continues. He meets his partner Charlie in a restaurant and observes the mafia meeting with 2 Japanese men. Nick and Charlie see another pair of Japanese men walk in and seize a small package while holding everyone at gunpoint. The man who takes the package kills the other Japanese men in the restaurant and flees the scene, with Nick on their tail. Nick catches up to one of the men who they discover is Sato, who is a member of the Yakuza. They bring him in for questioning but can't press charges, as the Japanese embassy want him to return to Japan to face prosecution, but they want Nick and Charlie to escort him. When they arrive in Osaka, they surrender Sato over to the Japanese police, only to discover they were duped by imposters. Nick convinces the Osaka police chief to allow them to observe the investigation, though their weapons are confiscated. They are assigned to Detective Masahiro, who straight away is treated badly by Nick, who takes pleasure in being rude to him, but Charlie keeps his cool and remains polite to the detective. When the police investigate a murder linked to Sato, Nick speaks with an American nightclub hostess, Joyce, and discovers Sato is fighting a gang war with a notorious crime boss, Sugai. Nick and Charlie join a police raid and Nick takes a few $100 bills from the crime scene. And Masahiro spots him and the following day tells Nick he wants nothing to do with him and calls him a thief. Nick calls him a snitch and demonstrates the money is counterfeit by burning one of the bills in front of the police chief, and warns him that they have a counterfeit war going on. After some drinks and karaoke with Charlie and Masahiro, Nick and Charlie walk back to their hotel, and what appears to be a prank, a motorcyclist steals Charlie's coat and leads him underground. Separated from Charlie, Nick watches in horror as Sato appears with several others and kills Charlie. Joyce comforts Nick at her apartment, and Masahiro appears and hands him Charlie's service pistol. Masahiro and Nick now have to work together and follow one of Sato's operatives, which leads them to a steel factory, where they find Sato meeting Sugai, and the package from New York they discover is a printing plate for American $100 bills. Nick attempts to stop Sato but gets busted by the police for carrying a gun. He now has to figure out a way to avoid being sent back, and to stop both plates falling into the hands of the Yakuza. Hans Zimmer composed a score to Black Rain. Hans had been composing music for films since the early 80s, but didn't really get much attention till his work on Rain Man, which impressed Ridley Scott and got Zimmer the job on Black Rain. He would work with Ridley 5 more times on Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, Hannibal, Black Hawk Down and Matchstick Men. Black Rain was a bit of a production nightmare for Zimmer from his own lack of experience. He later recounted, "By the time we got to the dub stage, I was living in fear. We were battling the system." Hans didn't have the classical training and was only familiar with orchestrations through his friendship with composer Stanley Myers, and would have assistance from the late Shirley Walker. Hans was more comfortable emulating an organic symphonic sound through his keyboards. Black Rain would be the composer's first foray into the genre of action, and Zimmer wasn't sure if his technique would suffice for the picture. It didn't help to have a completely unsupported producer on the project. One of them famously shouted to Zimmer at the Paramount screening of Black Rain that the composer's score was the worst piece of music he has ever heard. What the producer and even Hans himself wouldn't have predicted was just how influential the music for the film would become. It would set the stage for how Hans would tackle future scores, but would also be emulated by many other composers. The early 90s, Hans' career as a composer really took off, and today he is the most sought out composer for the big blockbusters, and he has now jumped onto the James Bond franchise with No Time to Die. I've discussed my feelings on Hans' work over the years. I feel his scores of the early 2000s up until today have been mostly uninspiring. There are a few superb scores along the way he has done, but there is a lot of repetition. Like you've heard the music before, he has recycled a lot of his work. This often happens when composers end up scoring like 4 films in a year. They end up reusing previous material. I enjoyed large chunks of the Batman Begins score, but there are cues in that film lifted from Black Rain. I love Hans Zimmer's work from his early days, and Black Rain honestly is one of my favourite scores of his. It's so rich and layered and has great themes throughout. Hans, as usual, makes use of electronic music. The score sounds somewhat similar to John Carpenter's and Alan Howarth's work on The Big Trouble in Little China. There is use of heavy percussion and the use of electric guitar to represent Michael Douglas's character Nick. Hans said he wanted to draw from Japanese culture but not execute the music in a straightforward manner, but interpret the music in his own way. There are cues that appear similar to Ryuichi Sakamoto's Merry Christmas Mr. Lawrence. Ryuichi would actually provide a song to the film called Laser Man. My favourite pieces of music are featured during the arrival into Osaka, and when we see Masa and Nick follow one of Sato's people to the steel factory. The bike chase and theme for Nick and Masa that represents their friendship are certainly the highlights. The score came to LP and tape and CD from Virgin Records in 1989. The album included a lot of pop music that featured throughout the film, such as UB40, Iggy Pop, Soul to Soul and Greg Allman's awesome song I'll Be Holding On. This track opens and ends the film, and Hans Zimmer co-wrote it, so some of the score is worked into the song. There was also a music video produced. The rest of the album included about 22 minutes of Hans' material, so a lot of music was missing. In 2012 there was a limited expanded 2-disc edition released on CD, including more of the score and alternative cues as well as the original album. This remaster includes an alternative track for the M bike chase, which is truly spectacular, one of the most epic pieces of music Hans has produced. This CD has been out of print for ages, but you can get the original CD album through second-hand sellers for like under £10, so it's pretty cheap. Hans Zimmer has often commented that he's somewhat amazed and even baffled to see his music for Black Rain become so influential, but it's clear it's an important piece of work in the history of digital film music, and it deserves all the praise it gets. So I highly recommend this score, and it's certainly worth adding to your collection. I didn't catch Black Rain growing up. It wasn't until I picked it up on Laserdisc in the early 2000s as I was hunting down Ridley Scott's back catalogue of movies. I'm sure I caught bits of it as a kid on TV. It's one of those movies they broadcast at 10 PM and you catch your dad watching it before you went to bed. Upon seeing it, I was very impressed with its visual style. The poster for the film is pure 80s, it just reeks of it. Guy with big hair, aviators and sitting on a motorbike, and the use of colour just represents that decade. The criticism thrown at it back in 1989 and even today with people watching it for the first time, it doesn't really do much with a cop thriller formula. Its biggest selling point is having a US production be set in Japan, but other than that it's dealing with themes and character motives that were used in many action movies and cop dramas. It uses all the classic tropes. Having the Yakuza be the villains of the story, it was becoming clear there was a shift in Hollywood movies and who would be the villains. For years it would be the Russians, and with the Cold War coming to an end, they were no longer perceived as the bad guys. So writers shifted their focus to the Japanese mafia. We saw Showdown in Little Tokyo and Rising Sun, for example, use the Yakuza. The writer of Black Rain said it was very much the zeitgeist of Japanese and American relations. There was a lot of friction going on at the time. As we learn from the mafia boss Sugai, he is taking revenge on the USA for shoving their values down their throats, and the Japanese forgot who they were over the years since the bomb was dropped on Japan ending World War II. He explains that the Americans created Sato, as it's his reckless ways that have caused these problems, as his actions go against the true spirit of the Japanese. Ridley Scott, as highlighted earlier, had a number of box office failures during the 80s. Blade Runner failed to hit at the time, but of course went on to be regarded as one of the most influential and important science fiction movies ever made. Legend was all style over substance and struggled to make a profit, and Someone to Watch Over Me fell by the wayside on its release in 1987, so Ridley needed to find that right property that would get him out of this slump. Black Rain really feels like a movie that would be ideal for his brother Tony Scott. This type of film is not something we'd seen from Ridley. You could argue it seems a bit by the numbers for him. He probably wouldn't have taken a job if it wasn't set in Japan. I ultimately feel it's a bit of a safe option for him. Knowing this type of movie would appeal more to the general public, and having Michael Douglas in the lead, you're somewhat guaranteed a good return at the box office. With the Japanese locations and the use of the city Osaka, we find ourselves in the world of Blade Runner again. No longer are we seeing the future of LA, but in fact the contemporary world of Japan. There are a number of shots in the film that feel ripped from that sci-fi classic. There was also a similar use of backlighting with those fans, and it all looks amazing, but you can't help but think Ridley is repeating himself in some areas. I can't blame him though. If you're going to shoot in Japan, you're not going to avoid the obvious when it comes to capturing these locations. It was good to see Michael Douglas playing a somewhat of an action hero. In Black Rain, his character is a perfect representation of an on-screen 80s cop. He has a mullet, he smokes, drinks, has an attitude, likes to break the rules, struggles to show his emotional side, he has a short temper but is a good guy but admits he is not perfect. He can at first come across as a bit unlikable. Once he arrives in Japan, he's really rude to Masahiro, and I think really unfairly. Michael's character Nick wants results and wants them quick, and just wants to get back home to avoid the risk of losing his job, so he takes his anger out on everyone around him. But he does have a great story arc as he admits stealing the money to Masa and being honest with himself to do the right thing, and ultimately completes his goal. His partner Charlie is certainly the most likeable of the pair, and Charlie tries his best to calm things down and doesn't take everything too seriously, and really wants to be everyone's friend. As his career is not on the line, he doesn't try to interfere too much with the Japanese police investigation. Once he's taken out of the picture by being killed by Sato, Nick is at a huge loss where he's now alone more than ever. The movie doesn't just push his death aside, they do spend time with Nick dwelling on the situation. It's unfortunate Charlie does get killed off as Andy Garcia provides such a great performance, and the film loses some of its sense of fun and humour, but it was obviously the right move in the story to provide this dramatic moment and to put further stress on Nick as the Yakuza close in. Joyce is the only one who understands Nick and tries to help him the best she can without herself getting into trouble. The filmmakers obviously hint there's an attraction between them, which doesn't really go anywhere. Her character has little to no development. She comes to the aid and helps him once he approaches her. And honestly, her character just feels shoehorned in and feels a bit of an afterthought. Kate does a great job with the part, but it feels like a wasted opportunity, and they could have explored their relationship more and her overall role within the story. Masahiro is definitely one of the most interesting characters. He is very much aligned with the Japanese culture and conflicts with Nick's approach to work, and Masa sticks to the rules and remains respectful to his superiors. I always feel sorry for his character, because he is doing the right thing but gets treated so badly by Nick. You just want Michael's character to leave Masa alone. It becomes clear in how the story plays out that the US culture and how Nick and Charlie do things seems more exciting, and Masa begins to let his guard down to follow in their footsteps and gets in trouble and gets suspended from his job. One of the best moments in the movie is when Nick visits him at his home and he tells Nick that he belongs to a group and they will no longer have him. It's a sad moment, and Ken, who has no experience in speaking English, makes this emotional scene work wonderfully. Yusaku does a superb job as Sato, and it's terribly sad he died so young. Despite not being a macho character for Nick to face up against, his persona and the look he has in his eyes really creates a menacing villain. He's cold and calculating, and being a man of few words, it makes him unpredictable at first. As the story unfolds, it demonstrates that his ego gets the better of him as he begins to lose control of what he so desires. His immaturity and lack of respect begins to show when he faces up against Sugai. This shows some similarities between him and Nick. They both don't follow the rules and get themselves in trouble. Black Rain is certainly a film I would recommend. All the performances are fantastic, and Michael Douglas shows that he can confidently take on the action genre, but also give us his own take on it. Despite the cliched tropes that come with the character of Nick, Michael brings his usual serious approach to the role, making his performance really memorable. I'm surprised they never made a sequel to this. I'm sure there would have been possibilities to go somewhere else with the character. It's a stunning looking movie which you always come to expect from Ridley Scott, and it's accompanied by an incredible soundtrack. Don't expect Black Rain to reinvent the wheel when it comes to the genre. It ticks all the boxes and sticks to what works. Critics may have been tired of these types of movies, but audiences certainly weren't.
You know Ronan, right?
Ronan?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know Ronan.
Good cop.
He is a good cop.
Busts his ass 14 hours a day, so he'll end up in debt for the rest of his life.
Listen, just because Ronan was desperate and he got tempted doesn't make him less wrong, Nick.
Yeah, that's bullshit, okay? You take something off the top of some dealer you locked up, you don't get crucified.
You've dishonored me and our department. You are a thief. I saw you take the money.
All right, watch this, okay? I only want to do this once. See how the impression hardly leaves the ashes? It's because there wasn't enough pressure. It should be higher. Now, this is good. It's as good as it comes. This ain't money. I don't know about the box, the club. Could have been samples, could have been plates. You guys got a counterfeiting war going on.
This is an old beer, a prototype. The new ones will be like everything we make. Perfect.
Hey, you want the plate? You get me close to him.
You have no part in this.
I told you, no guns.
I thought we were working together, goddammit! He went right past you! Right past you, he went! Jesus Christ! That the guy's getting away!
Hey, what's going on?
What's going on?
We are going to put you on a plane. If you return, you'll be arrested.
I had been suspended. I am no longer an assistant inspector. I belong to a group. They will not have me anymore.
Sometimes, you gotta go for it. You get me close, I'll hit the mark.
Here I am, Nick!
Why should I trust you?
Because you got nothing.